Well, let's get started. And as other people come in, they just have to pay more. So, Dr. Rogers and I and Robert Satterley started a program a couple of years ago. And Crystal was the first person in the program where music students take speech science and voice disorders and do a research project. And for that, they have to pay more to graduate or something. I'm not sure how that goes. But, and they all think that they all think it's a good experience. So Jane and I are really happy about that. So part of that whole thing is presenting their research project in front of live people, no matter where they are in the world now, apparently. So that's what Brianna is going to do. She's going to present a wonderful little project that she has completed now, in which, like the other students, they ask the question, when I make sound, what happens? Actually, I think that's the main question. And so that's what Brianna is going to present now. So thank you, Brianna. Looking forward to this. So take it away.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Scherer. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. All right, great. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for joining me today for the presentation of my class research project. I so appreciate your support, and I hope that you enjoy my presentation. Just a couple of reminders before we get started. This is being recorded for my personal records and to share with those who could not attend the meeting today. So if there's any concern about that, please let me know at this time. Please also take a moment to make sure that your mic is muted if it's not already. If you have any really burning questions at any point during the presentation, or if you'd like to hear any of the audio examples again, please feel free to unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask. There will be a period for questions at the end. If you'd like to send any questions for this period during the presentation, please send those through the chat function and I'll address them at that time. And thank you again so much for being here, and we'll go ahead and get started with my project titled Examining Relative Intensity and Vibrato Waveform in Relation to Emotional Intent and Registration Transitions. Two of the most daunting tasks for new and experienced singers are navigating the dreaded transitional areas of the voice and understanding the acoustic changes one can control through emotional affect to evoke the type of performance we wish to give. As a lyric soprano, I am interested in understanding these concepts in my own voice, and as a voice pedagogue, I want to help my students identify, understand, and navigate these areas as well. It is important to employ objective measures of variables related to these concepts, which can help clarify their meaning and use. In order to examine these areas together, we need to first establish some definitions used for this project. For the purposes of this study, I have adapted a three-part voice registration approach, where the three registrations of the voice are defined as chest, middle, and head registers. The first transition from chest to middle is the primo or first passaggio. The transition from the middle to head is the secondo passaggio or second transition. According to Scott McCoy on pages 236 and 237 of his book, Your Voice and Inside View, for a soprano, the expected location of the primo passaggio is between C4 and A4 on the piano keyboard, and E5 to A5 for the secondo passaggio. When considering formant relationships, as noted by Kenneth Bozeman on page 32 of his book, Practical Vocal Acoustics, women have fewer formants within keyboard range, often only 3 from which to form their timbre. It is important to remember when considering the data in this project and the relationship between formants and harmonic intensity. spectral changes were identified orally and visually in this project via audio recording and spectrogram analysis. Acoustic and harmonic intensity rely on the relationship of vowel formants to the harmonic series for a given frequency or pitch. When navigating registration transition, we expect these relationships to change significantly. There are few scientific studies in existence that analyze spectra to shed light on the intensity changes that we perceive orally during registration transition. Similarly, this method of analysis has not often been applied to the acoustic and harmonic intensity changes perceived when a singer applies different emotional affects to their performance. The purpose of this study is to record and measure acoustic and harmonic intensity changes relative to passaggio transitions and emotional intent, and to examine how vibrato rate and extent are altered in relation to these changes in intensity. The application of this information has vast performance and pedagogic value, including the means to objectively measure voice technique strategies, to discern the most successful strategy of performance for a desired effect, and to better understand and adapt a voice technique for various acoustic environments. Based on the prior knowledge, expectations, and considerations I've just discussed, the following hypotheses were made for each section of my project. For passaggio transitions for the primo passaggio, I hypothesized that when passing through the primo passaggio, there will be a relatively higher intensity for the higher harmonics for the lower or chest registration. In the secondo passaggio, I hypothesized that when passing through the secondo passaggio, there will be a relatively higher intensity at the first harmonic, or H1, because it will match F1, or the first formant, and relatively lower intensity at the second harmonic, or H2. For emotional intent, I hypothesized that the warmer or sadder the emotional intent, the greater relative intensity of the lower harmonics. And regarding vibrato rate and extent, that the bereavement example would have less extent and rage would have the greater extent. This is a list of the hardware and software that I used for this project. The application of each will be discussed over the next several slides. The picture here is the actual computer setup from the day that I recorded my excerpts. This is actually my husband's computer. He is an IT manager, which is why he has so many screens and such a nice setup. But this is my audio recording equipment. So the audio interface, headphones, and mic, which I'm actually using to talk to you right now also. So I recorded these in our living room, which is where his computer is, which is a much larger space than my office. So it was a great resource to have. I am a classically trained lyric soprano and the sole subject in this study. I used my external microphone and audio interface to record two types of singing excerpts into PROT, which is a spectral analysis software. Vibrato was used throughout each excerpt with approximately 2 vibrato cycles per note, with a dynamic level around mezzo forte, using best classical singing technique practices. I did not consciously attempt to make any alterations to singing technique beyond the variables being studied, meaning that no conscious alterations in the passaggio transitions or alterations beyond emotional intent changes in the emotional intent excerpts. It is important to note that the room setup during recording was consistent for all excerpts, that the same distance of 6 feet from the microphone was maintained, and that all excerpts were recorded during the same session. The first excerpt I recorded was an A major scale, which I sang ascending and descending the scale on the vowels A and A from A3 to A4. I then repeated this exercise on both vowels ascending and descending from A4 to A5. The scale was chosen based on the expected passaggio locations for my voice type, as previously noted and defined by McCoy, and shown here on the staff and keyboard, highlighted in blue. There are approximately 2 vibrato cycles per sung pitch through this excerpt. I confirmed transition locations orally and visually via spectrogram and auditory analysis. I created the scale sheet music and piano keyboard graphic using music notation software MuseScore version 3.5. The second excerpt that I recorded was a 12 measure passage from the aria Salce Salce Ave Maria from Giuseppe Verdi's Otello. I recorded this excerpt 3 times with 3 separate emotional intents: neutral or no intent, rage, which is immense anger, and bereft or overcome with grief. I chose this piece to examine emotional intent due to the intensely emotional situation at this point in the opera's plot. Desdemona, who sings this aria, is waiting for her husband Otello to kill her. The pure vowels of Italian language were also a factor in choosing this piece. The small section from the full excerpt, highlighted in blue on the score here, is what I ultimately used for analysis. The prolonged E vowel, highlighted in gold at the beginning of the phrase, and the prolonged O vowel, highlighted in purple at the end of the phrase. In both types of excerpts, I next made a series of measurements at the identified applicable locations and recorded these values into an Excel spreadsheet. The first set of measurements taken were vibrato rate and vibrato extent. Vibrato extent is the difference in hertz between the top peak of the vibrato cycle and the bottom peak of the vibrato cycle, illustrated in the figure here as dashed blue lines. Extent measures were then converted to semitones from hertz using the calculation 39.86 times log of f2 over f1. In Western music, intervals smaller than 1 semitone or half step are not commonly notated or called for. However, in non-Western music scales, smaller intervals are common and denoted by cents. 100 cents is equal to 1 semitone, which is also the equivalent of 1 half step in Western music. Next, vibrato rate was measured. The amount of time between each vibrato cycle, which is the period of that cycle, was measured in seconds. At the top peak of each cycle, illustrated in the Scherer figure as the solid black lines, in this figure at the bottom valley of the vibrato cycle. To convert this measurement from period cycle to rate, the calculation 1 divided by the period duration in hertz was used. With all of the data collected regarding vibrato rate and extent, I then made figures to illustrate various comparisons, which will be seen later in the results section. After vibrato rate and extent measures were taken, I then moved on to spectral analysis. For the scales excerpts, I selected the top peak of the second vibrato cycle for the note that occurred just before and just after the registration shift. For the Verdi excerpts, I selected the top peak of the vibrato cycle in the middle of the sustained pitch. The spectrogram, which is this right here, is here for the Verdi neutral E vowel. So you can see that the selection or measurements were taken from the second peak of the vibrato cycle. And then this larger image here is a full spectral slice, and it shows the harmonic intensity values for that location, which was also taken right here at the top of the cycle. I recorded the first 6 harmonic values for each location and copied this data into Excel, and then created figures to compare changes in intensity across registration shift or emotional intent. And then as you can see on the figure, I've marked where each harmonic value is taken, so H1 through H6, and it correlates to the peaks here. As orientation to the data we are about to explore regarding passaggio transitions, I would like to offer the following. Measurements were taken at 2 locations in each scale excerpt, which have been split into ascending and descending sections for analysis. These locations are the note just before the registration transition and the note just after the registration transition. To assist with clarity, I implemented a color coding system. In the following spectrograms, score excerpts, and figures, the color orange will signify the higher pitch, and the color blue will signify the lower pitch. The keys highlighted in blue on the piano keyboard are the notes of the A major scale from A3 to A4, which are also notated on the music staff. The image below is a narrowband spectrogram. Each of the black bands represents a harmonic. The blue line represents the sung pitches or fundamental frequencies, ascending and descending the scale, first on the A vowel and then on the A vowel. I'm now going to play audio of the full scale ascending and descending for each vowel, and I'll follow along with my cursor on the spectrogram. Next, we will look at the locations of passaggio transitions for each scale individually. This is a location of the primo passaggio transition from chest to middle voice while ascending on the A vowel. It is important to note that the spectrogram shown here is not for the full scale excerpt, but only the portion of the scale where the registration shift is happening. This will be true for each transition point specific spectrogram shown for the rest of this section on my project. As I play the full ascending A excerpt and then just the transition point, be aware of quality changes you can detect, or can you detect these transitions orally? What is the difference between each pitch? The change in vibrato waveform and change in quality of the sound indicate the transition point. The blue and orange lines on the spectrogram illustrate the point from which measurements were taken from the top of the second vibrato cycle for each note. Next, we have the same locations before and after transition marked while descending the same scale, also on the A vowel. I would like to point out that the transition while descending happened a half step lower from where the transition occurred while ascending the scale. As before, I will now play the full descending scale and then just the point of transition. Now we see the transition location for the A vowel ascending the scale. This occurred between the same notes as the A vowel ascending the scale. Do you notice any differences in perceptible change between the A and A vowel at this location? Finally, we have the primo passaggio transition descending on the A vowel, which also occurred one half step lower on the scale than the ascending transition. This half step lower transition point in the descending passage was consistent across both vowels. Now that we have seen the locations where each measurement occurred, let's look at the data. First, we have vibrato extent, as a reminder are the blue dashed lines on the Scherer figure, which was measured for 2 consecutive vibrato cycles for each vowel, represented on the graphs here as dots. These are the dots here, and since there were 2 vibrato cycles measured, that's why there's 2 for each note. The trend lines show us the average change in semitones from before to after the primo-passaggio transition. As we can see across both vowels, vibrato extent was greater at the higher pitch in the middle register than for the lower pitch or chest register. While ascending the scale, the A vowel extent increased by approximately 50 cents or half a semitone, while for the A vowel, extent increased by only 30 cents. While descending the scale, extent decreased for both vowels by around 120 cents or slightly more than 1 semitone or half step. Now let's look at vibrato rate, represented by the black lines on the Scherer figure. Here the measurements were averaged together over the same 2 vibrato cycles that were measured for extent. We can see a consistent rate decrease while ascending and rate increase while descending for both vowels, though the rate for the A vowel is consistently higher overall. This trend of rate decrease with extent increase and vice versa perhaps goes against what one might expect. However, this is a consistent correlation, a sort of trade-off in these excerpts. This could be attributed to tension or cricothyroid muscle contraction. Let's listen to the ascending A excerpt once more to see if we can perceive the rate and extent correlation. A possible explanation for the higher A vowel rate consistency is that the singer is more comfortable making the registration transition in the more open vowel or less comfortable with the more closed A vowel in this registration. These figures compare the first 6 harmonics. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. For the note just before and just after registration transition for the A vowel only. The top figure is the ascending shift, the bottom is for the descending shift. In the ascending transition, we can see that both notes have similar intensity at the first harmonic. However, the harmonics over 600 Hz are greater for the lower note, C sharp, than for the higher note, which is D. This is consistent with expectations for differences between the chest register and the middle register and indicates more glottal closure for the lower note. The lower note will also sound brighter. Let's see if we can hear this change. In the descending transition, there's a significant difference in format tracking, where the higher note C sharp pre-transition is matching the second format with the fourth harmonic, which is seen here. This indicates a headier quality. The post-transition C is matching the first format more closely. As we listen to the A descending transition once more, there will be a clear change in quality caused by the harmonic format relationship shift. For the same scale passages, ascending and descending, but now on the A vowel, the spectra are much more similar before and after the transition. There's more energy or higher intensity for the higher pitch and stronger match of the first format with the second harmonic in both the ascending and descending scale. Also in both transitions, the sixth harmonic is higher for the higher pitch and also indicating a stronger F2 match, though we do not see it here as only the first 6 harmonics have been recorded. There's a similar difference of about 5 dB in the ascending transition, which is expected due to registration shift, and an even smaller difference of only about 2 dB in the descending transition. This would indicate a much more difficult to discern change. Let's listen to both excerpts again to observe this. Now we'll examine the secondo passaggio in the same manner. Again, here we have piano keys highlighted in blue to show the notes of the A major scale. this time from A4 to A5, also notated on the staff. As before, the image below is a narrow band spectrogram with the black line showing the harmonic series and the blue line representing the sung pitches or fundamental frequencies, ascending and descending the scale. First on the A vowel and then the A vowel. This is the full excerpt for the secondo passaggio. For the secondo passaggio, the registration shift is happening between notes F♯5 and G5 in both ascending and descending scales and over both vowels. Here we see the ascending spectrogram for the A vowel. Now let's listen to the full ascending passage and then just the transition point. Already you can see that the vibrato waveform is much more consistent throughout this passaggio region. Therefore, determination of the registration shift relies much more heavily on aural perception of quality changes and vibrato cycle differences. Now I will play the descending A passage. Let's listen closely to see if we can hear the transition point. Then I will play just the transition point. Now we will examine the A vowel ascending at the secondo passaggio, hearing the full passage again and then just the transition point. And finally, the A descending passage. As in the primo passaggio, we will start our data comparisons with vibrato extent. Again, for this set of data, extent was measured for 2 consecutive vibrato cycles. Unlike in the primo ascending transition, here the extent decreases for both vowels by approximately 50 cents or half of a semitone, for the A vowel and approximately 30 cents for the A vowel. More consistent with the primo transition, in the descending passages, vibrato extent decreased for the A vowel by approximately 30 cents. However, there was no discernible or statistical change for the A vowel. As in the primo passaggio, vibrato rate for the secondo passaggio was averaged over 2 cycles. In the ascending passages, we see consistency between the 2 vowels, a rate increase of about 50 Hz. This is exactly the opposite of what we saw at the primo transition, as both the rate and extent trends have flip-flopped in the findings of the A vowel in the secondo passaggio. This could indicate the trade-off, extent increase for rate decrease and vice versa, in the opposite direction from what we observed in the primo passaggio. In the descending passage, however, this is inconsistent over both vowels. For the A vowel, rate decreased by approximately 10 Hz, however, rate increased by approximately 22 Hz for the A vowel. Due to the small sample size, this inconsistency cannot be attributed to anything definite. Now we'll look at relative intensity for the secondo passaggio. Here we have the harmonic intensities for the secondo passaggio A vowel. There is a lot of consistency between the higher note intensities and the lower note intensities regardless of approach. We see that both in the ascending and descending scale, that F sharp, the lower pitch, is matching F1 well, and also has a peak around H4, which is matching the third formant. It's just this right here, we see it in both of those. The higher note G has a greater intensity at F1 in both the ascending and descending approach, and a greater emphasis on F4, which results in a headier, more woofy quality. So this would be the correlation here for the higher note. As we listen to these excerpts again, we're listening for the woofier quality in the higher pitch. For the A vowel at the secondo passaggio, there is some inconsistency in the ascending scale. F sharp before the shift had a higher intensity for the first two harmonics, and also F1 matching, and the H4 F3 matching, as with the A vowel. G after the shift has F1 matching, but a lower intensity, which is not expected, and does not have a strong F4 boost. This could be caused by less coordination or comfort with the brighter, more closed A vowel at this passaggio. In the descending scale, we see intensity shifting and format tracking consistent with what we saw with the A vowel. F1 matching is consistent for both notes, with the higher note before the shift having the greater intensity to F1. We also see the same F3 H4 matching for the lower note and a boost over 4,000 Hz for the higher note. This is important to note. The findings of this study are not consistent overall with literature on format tracking. Here we see F1 tracking through the passaggio, which is not expected. Let's listen to the transition points for the A vowel again. In the second subsection of my project, as mentioned previously in the methodology slides, I employed the same measures of vibrato rate, vibrato extent, and harmonic intensities to examine how emotional intent influenced spectral intensities and vibrato waveform. Here again is the musical score excerpt of Verdi's Ave Maria from Otello that I recorded and analyzed to compare effects of emotional intent. As with the scale excerpts in the previous section, I have color-coded each vowel, E with the gold color and O with the purple. I will now play for you all three emotional intent excerpts, neutral, rage, and bereft. As we listen, I will indicate each excerpt along the narrowband spectrogram. Now we will examine each excerpt individually to get a better look at the spectrogram and the locations from which data was collected. The first is the neutral excerpt, which was included as a control to compare against the two emotionally charged intents. This is the first spectrogram excerpt that we have looked at in this project that includes the microphone signal above the spectrogram. The gold line for the E vowel and the purple line for the O vowel are placed on the spectrogram at the location at which measurements were taken, the top peak of the second vibrato cycle for each vowel. Let's listen now to the neutral excerpt by itself. Here is the second excerpt, which is the rage intent. And finally, we have the bereft excerpt. This view of the narrowband spectrogram has been edited to show only the E and O vowels for each emotional intent. There are a few things to note before we look at the data analysis for each of these vowels. It is important to remember that each vowel is sung on a different pitch, E on G flat 5, O on C flat 5, and that the E vowel is at the beginning of the musical and prosodic phrase, while the O vowel is at the end of the musical and prosodic phrase in this excerpt. When looking at the vibrato waveform on the spectrogram and considering vibrato extent, the top peak and bottom valley measurements have been recorded in hertz, then converted to semitones. Due to the difference in pitch, this means that while the difference in hertz, especially visually, appears to be much different for the E vowel when compared to the O vowel, in semitones, they are actually not statistically different. This was not pertinent to discuss for the scale excerpts, as the pitches were the small interval of a half step away from each other. Here we have a much larger interval of a perfect fifth. It is also important to note that there is a flaw in how Prot software is capturing the O vowel vibrato waveform. In this excerpt, observing the third harmonic waveform, highlighted here in the teal color, so this band right here, is a more accurate depiction of the true waveform, which can also be observed auditorily when I play the audio excerpt. As in the scale excerpts, we will begin by looking at vibrato extent, which as a reminder is illustrated in the Scherer figure by the dashed blue lines, peak to valley. Here we see vibrato extent across both the E and O vowels for all three emotional intents, neutral, rage, and bereft. The values for each vowel within each intent are as follows. The neutral E was 2.2 semitones, the O was 2.5 semitones. Rage E was 3.25 semitones, and Rage O was 2.55 semitones. The bereft E was 2.82 semitones, and the bereft O was 2.78 semitones. The spread of semitone values for the E vowel is 1.03 semitones, so just over 1 half step on the piano keyboard. For the O vowel, semitone value spread is 0.28 semitones, or just under 30 cents. Now the data for vibrato extent is collapsed across both the E and O vowels in the top figure with the purple bars. As we can see from this figure, rage had the greatest extent at 2.9 semitones, bereft was slightly less at 2.7 semitones, and neutral the least extent at 2.4 semitones. The overall difference between each intent is half of a semitone, or 50 cents. Statistical analyses were conducted for this data due to the small sample size, only having one subject and only one recording made per excerpt. The purpose of which was to determine if the data is or is not statistically significantly different. The results of these analyses are illustrated by the black arrows and text between the bars on both figures. Another measure that could be included for similar reasons is standard deviation for each semitone value. However, again, due to small sample size, I did not include this information here. For extent collapsed across the two vowels, neutral is significantly different from rage or bereft. However, rage and bereft are not significantly different from each other. The second figure shows the inverse of the first figure, extent collapsed across the three emotional intents. Here the E vowel averaged to an extent of 2.78 semitones, and the O vowel averaged to an extent of 2.6 semitones. Now a much smaller spread of not even 20 cents, or 0.20 semitones. Statistical analyses showed that these values are not significantly different from each other. Now, as we examine vibrato rate, illustrated by the solid black lines on the Scherer figure, we are looking at the E and O vowels separately for each emotional intent. For each intent, the vibrato rates are as follows. Neutral E was 5.6 Hz and O was 6 Hz. Rage E was 5.8 Hz and O was 6.4 Hz. Bereft E was 6 Hz and bereft O was 5.9 Hz. The eval may have an overall slower rate than the oval. However, it is not statistically significant enough to determine definitively. The rage exert has the fastest vibrato rate, and the neutral exert has the slowest vibrato rate. Here we have the data for vibrato rate collapsed across both the E and O vowels in the top figure. Rage had the fastest rate of 6.2 Hz, bereft has a rate of 6.0 Hz, and neutral the slowest rate of 5.8 Hz. The overall spread between the three intents is only 0.4 Hz, as shown again by the black arrows in text, and as confirmed through statistical analyses. The rates for all three intents are not statistically significantly different from each other. As in the extent figures, the bottom bar graph shows rate collapsed across all three emotional intents, with the E vowel having a rate of 5.8 Hz and the O vowel a rate of 6.2 Hz. The spread between these two vowels is also 0.4 Hz, again, not statistically different from each other, as confirmed by analysis. For harmonic intensity comparison, each vowel was analyzed separately across three intents. First, we have the E vowel, which occurs on the pitch G flat 5. Neutral has a spectrogram with lower values than rage or bereft. There is an approximately 6 dB difference at H2, which will create a significant audible quality difference and softer sound. Compared to neutral, rage had the highest H4 value, indicating a louder sound with more adduction. Bereft had the highest third harmonic value, which also indicates more sound and adduction as compared to neutral. Here we have the same graph for the E vowel, all three intents, with spectral slope for the neutral as the teal dashed line, and rage and bereft combined, the red dashed line. Neutral has the steepest spectral slope, which suggests that the laryngeal source spectrum is steeper. The flatter slope of the combined rage and bereft trendline indicates more adduction for rage and bereft. For the O vowel, which occurred on C flat 5, we again see that neutral had the lowest overall spectrum values. Rage and bereft have very similar spectra, with a higher intensity at H2, indicating higher intensity at the laryngeal level, more subglottal pressure, and more adduction, which is also indicated here by the higher intensities for rage and bereft in the 1500 to 2000 Hz range. A difference between E and O vowel is that we see an enhancement for F3, which is occurring near H6. As with the eval, here now is the same graph for O, showing spectral slope. The difference between neutral versus rage and bereft combined is even greater for this vowel. The dashed teal line showing a steeper slope for neutral indicates less adduction. The red dashed line for rage and bereft combined shows a flatter slope indicating more adduction. Now that we've looked at spectra for the two vowels separately in each intent, let us also examine them together. Across all three intents, the O vowel has less intensity than the E vowel. The fundamental frequency or pitch and the location in the voice register has a direct effect on intensity, so this finding is expected. Intensities across both vowels are consistently higher for rage and bereft than for neutral. Intensity values for the E vowel, which for neutral was 64 dB, rage 68 dB, and bereft 71 dB, have an overall difference of 4 to 5 dB. Intensity values for the O vowel, with neutral being 53 dB, rage 59 dB, and bereft 55 dB, have an overall difference of 4 to 6 dB. The lower intensity for the O vowel in the bereft excerpt is due to the choice to reduce intensity for emotional effect. Overall, the data for the bereft O is inconsistent. A difference of 5 to 6 dB at H2, which is seen in both the rage and bereft excerpts, compared to neutral, is suspected to be substantially different auditorily. The greatest contrast in intensity between vowels is seen between the bereft E and O, a difference of 16 dB. Let's listen to all three intents one last time, paying attention to intensity contrast within each intent. A spectral anomaly was observed in the primo passaggio scale excerpts. The squiggles visible between the dark bands that represent the energy of the harmonic series coming through in the spectrogram are called subharmonics, meaning below a harmonic. These are most prevalent in the primo passaggio region and may indicate instability or tension of the vocal mechanism in this area, but alone do not indicate any major problems or pathologies. So you can see here, they're pretty clear between these two harmonics, and then again between the first three. These are visible only in a narrowband spectrogram, like those used throughout this project. For pedagogical application, the presence of subharmonics could simply indicate an area of instability when coordination of the mechanism can be refined through vowel modification or release of tension. So the first time we saw this was in the ascending passage of the primo passaggio, which I'll play again. Just you'll be listening for kind of a rough or scratchy sort of quality. And then again, this is the A descending for also the primo passaggio. Now that we've seen the findings of the study, we can make some conclusions. First, a reiteration that the purpose of the study is to record and measure acoustic and harmonic intensity changes relative to passaggio transitions and emotional intent, and to examine how vibrato rate and extent are altered in each condition. Our hypothesis for the passaggio transition, when passing through the primo passaggio, there will be a relatively higher intensity for the higher harmonics for the lower or chest registration. This hypothesis was partially supported for the A vowel. Ascending H3, H4, and H5 were relatively high for the lower note. And for descending A, H2, H3, and H5 were relatively high for the lower note. The hypothesis was not supported for the A vowel. The spectra were similar except for H2, which was 3 to 5 dB greater for the middle register. The secondo passaggio hypothesis was when passing through the secondo passaggio, there will be a relatively higher intensity at H1 because it will match F1 and relatively lower intensity at H2. This hypothesis was supported for the A vowel. It was partially supported for the A vowel, supported for descending, but not supported in the ascending. And the hypotheses for emotional intent regarding harmonic intensity is that the warmer or sadder the emotional intent, the greater the intensity of lower harmonics. This hypothesis was not supported for either vowel. Neutral had the steepest slope, which implies greater intensity for the lower harmonics. Rage and bereft had similar spectra, except at H3 for the E vowel, which was 5 dB greater for bereft. And regarding vibrato rate and extent, the hypothesis was that bereavement would have less extent and rate than rage, which would have greater extent. This hypothesis was supported for extent. The data show that rage had the greater vibrato extent compared to bereft and neutral. Rate was not different across all three emotional intents. There were some limitations in this study, the first being only one subject, which was myself. The second is that recording excerpts had to happen at home with my personal setup, which, though adequate for this study, is not ideal regarding the size and shape of the rooms in my apartment and needing to set up and monitor audio levels, etc. myself. Having only myself perception of my singing was also a limitation. Going forward, now having gained experience with completing this sort of study, I have insight in how I can improve further pursuits. I would record more repetitions of each excerpt to have a larger sample size to compare across. I would intentionally increase the number of vibrato cycles per note or vowel being studied so that there's more data. I would record harmonic series values beyond the first 6 to include formants through F6. I would also like to study articulation, timing, and dynamic range. Many of these amendments or additions could also be achieved and enhanced by also having more subjects with different Fox or voice types. I want to thank you all so much again for joining me today for my presentation. Thank you to my colleagues Carolyn and Lucas for a very supportive and productive year of learning together. Many thanks to Dr. Rogers for her encouragement and suggestion to extend the invitation for this presentation to both voice pedagogy classes. And finally, many thanks to Dr. Scherer for his guidance, support, and expertise and perseverance in helping me formulate and complete my project at every step of the process. I'm so grateful for this very illuminating experience. It has opened up a new world of interest and possibility. I will now open the floor, so to speak, for any comments or questions.
Yay!
Very nice. Very nice.
Thank you.
Great presentation. That's a real model of a presentation. So thank you, Brianna. So I know that there are about 74 questions. So please ask away, and can be on anything, on the research, on the experience, on why was the right hand used most of the time for the typing. But anything that comes to mind is appropriate here, because this is an educational moment.
I just want to say it was extremely well organized, and everything was so clearly explained, and it was so understandable why you did the research exactly the way you did. It was beautifully scientific.
Thank you so much.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I again want to echo how beautifully organized all of those clear graphics. Oh my goodness. I'm curious, and you may have spoken to this in a previous setting, the choice of emotions, particularly when could you talk a bit about when you say sadder versus warmer, and these two negative emotions that seem to be in extremes of valence, or rather in arousal, in like this extreme energy, right? And
Yeah.
Could you talk about what bereft is in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. So I chose these. I mean, to me, in this moment in the opera, like bereft is probably the closest to what she's. I mean, she's feeling a lot of things. A lot of things are going on at this point. I think she's probably also feeling rage. I would be if my husband was about to murder me and I knew it. So I chose these because they were both really intense, and I immediately thought of both of them when considering this excerpt. But I knew that they would also be contrasting more, like a pretty good contrast. And my thought around it was that rage, would be really it's like more of an attack, and it would be maybe like brighter or just have different inflection or emphasis in different places, and that bereavement or like feeling grief would be like kind of softer and warmer because it's more like a sigh or like crying. So I picked those for their contrast, but also because they were like I already thought of them in relationship to the aria itself. So I hope that makes sense and answer your questions.
I'm thinking too of similar work, and I'm recently been grilled on some emotional research, and I think as you continue and build out these exploring emotion, you might look at Russell models and look also at joy and extremes in good and bad.
Yeah.
And so in depression is beautiful. Oh.
Very cool.
Yeah, the point, part of the point is that how different should the emotions be on what scales that would
Mhm.
show up in specifically identifiable differences in the production. And that's what everybody dealing with emotional recordings and studies have had to wrestle with, because you get so many non-significant differences across different words. And then, as you know, even especially in the acting field, where different emotions can be such a wide range, because you have to take context into account, and you have to, is it live stage or is it film or whatever. And so emotion is a really hard project. um, but there is definitely, from an interpretive point of view, some serious do's and don'ts relative to combining those with technique and expression. And as you know, you want to save the voice usually, but you want your face and your physicality to imitate what your intent is.
Mhm.
And so we have that to wrestle with too. It could be for singers who don't want to mess up their voice too much technically, that they have to rely on those other things even more.
Mhm.
But the more you can control vibrato where it's meaningful, vibrato extent or rate, which can be meaningful in different ways, and the spectra such that you're shaping the vocal tract but not really messing too much with injuring the vocal folds, etc.
Mhm.
So that's why, from a pedagogical point of view, this kind of study is invaluable, like the other ones in this line that we've been doing in this program, actually, and for a couple of recent theses. Sorry, I went that direction. Now let's have some more questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could kind of talk about your secondo presagio and where you were looking at the scales. Um, and I guess maybe for my own knowledge, how could you tell that that specific note was your flip point? Because when I was listening, I could hear there was a transition, but not necessarily at that note. And then when we look at the spectrogram, you know, the squiggles look pretty consistent. So I was just wondering what your process was of choosing those spots.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is much more difficult here than the first one. The primo, my vibrato was like so extremely different between transition that it was so easy to tell. So like you said, it was not as different in the vibrato waveform at the secondo, so it was actually like a lot more difficult. I have a sense, of course, of where that happens for me, just based on my own awareness of my body and experience singing. Um, but it was definitely like an auditory thing, and really looking at like where the intensities were and what harmonics at that area, and that played a huge factor in where, like, I was like, oh nope, it's right there. So it would definitely much more relied on just like knowledge of my own body, um, my auditory perception of it, knowing my voice really well, and then also just looking at the different harmonic intensities. But it was a lot more difficult, which actually, like, I'm proud of, because I'm glad that that transition is fairly smooth. So it is harder to tell, but yeah, it definitely made it difficult.
So, sorry. So, did you notice that, like, when you say the harmonic intensities, were they more intense in your, like, after or more intense before the
Yes.
transition?
Yeah, so if you remember on like the spectral intensity graphs, it's just
Mm.
about the relationships of formants with what harmonic, which with harmonic in the series. So on the spectrogram, that's nicer, right? Because that band is gonna be darker. It's gonna be more
Okay.
black on the spectrogram, so you can kind of tell. And then obviously looking at the actual values themselves. But that, yeah, that was like a really big factor, big key tool to use to tell.
Got it. Cool. Thanks. It was a great
As a
presentation.
follow-up, when you have this transition between um, across the boundaries, did you feel that it was more acoustic than physiologic, or did you think maybe there was more a physiological change that you were making inside your throat mouth, creating the acoustic difference?
Yeah, I honestly think it, yeah, I think it was more just knowing what that feels like. So I think it definitely is more physiological than even being able to hear it myself anyway. Like I know what that feels like for myself. So I think it honestly is more kinesthetic. as far
Do
as
you think
determining that.
do you think you are feeling do you think you are feeling a change in the placement of tissue versus feeling the change in acoustics?
That's a good question. That's really hard to answer, right? Because I think for me, it's like feeling the change of where the resonance, what the resonance feels like in my body. Um, so both. I don't know. So I mean, I would say no that like, yeah, tissues are changing to make that happen, but it's also like feeling the result of the resonance. It's I don't know. Yeah, that's a really hard question.
I don't know what it is in the female so much, but in the male, it's when there's a strong change, sometimes it feels like there's a big change in where the articulators, the structures, the tissue has changed too. But if you concentrate on just keeping the vocal tract exactly the same
Mm-hmm.
and and hear and feel the same thing, then you realize that sometimes a pure acoustic change can be interpreted basically incorrectly as some sort of physiological shift,
Yeah.
or it's really subtle, just a little more tilt of the larynx, a little tongue thing, or whatever. Except when you do the full vowel modification where you know you're changing tongue position to
Mm-hmm.
really shift those formats to make it easier. This is a very important and interesting pedagogical and more current, actually, pedagogical area of interest and concern. More questions, Crystal?
Hello.
Hey,
So, great job in the presentation.
thank you.
One of the questions that maybe potentially to consider is on the physiological aspect. We know that speech production or voice production is actually a result of a combination of antagonistic muscles when we sing, speak, whatsoever. Based on your findings in the vibrato rate and the subordinate, the subharmonics,
Mhm.
that's a word, right? Yeah. I was posterior cricoarytenoid muscles were taken into consideration before.
I mean, I've never considered that about that particular phenomenon, but it's really interesting. Something I'm sad we couldn't do for this was using the like measuring the muscles, which obviously couldn't happen because we couldn't be in the lab. Thank you, COVID. But no, that's not something that I had considered, but that's definitely interesting for sure.
And
So the
sorry.
PCA to what? Control adduction?
Right. So I was thinking about so for posterior cricoarytenoid muscles, they basically look like a crisscross.
Those are the interretinoid muscles.
I am so sorry. The interarytenoid muscles, my apologies, when they contract, that kind of changes the arytenoid, the orientation of the arytenoid cartilages. So I wonder if that's potentially something that would contribute to the acoustic differences relative to different emotional interpretation, or just relative to where the pitch is at in the scale.
Yeah, that's exactly right, in the sense that, as Brianna was saying, the EGG, the electroglottic just the band, not the electromyography, was not used. And so, as you in your study, Crystal, you had a quasi-measure of adduction relative to analyzing the EGG, which Brianna was not able to do, nor was Brianna able to measure sublaural pressure, which actually enters into this because it's probably higher for the rage, and that explains a lot of that stuff. So adduction, sublaural pressure for future projects obviously are primary variables. Like, as you're pointing out, Crystal, the primary variables to consider to help explain. So it's not just acoustic formatting business, but it's also the laryngeal situation that creates the signal that goes into the vocal tract. And that's a missing link here for Brianna's project.
Okay. And also to build on to Mickey's note relative to emotional interpretations, I would really encourage you to to look into literatures by Klaus Scherer and Johann Sundberg. They have done some research on emotional interpretation, but their approach, the way they approach it is to choose a certain range of emotions with very simple emotional cues like anger, joy, tender, something like that. So those will be something to consider if you choose to move forward your study.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
More questions? More comments? More concerns?
One other question is, you talked about in future studies wanting to explore articulation, and I wonder if you could talk about how that would look. If you know, you might take away words or do more with them, or how that would.
Yeah, so like my experience coming out of my classes and everything last year would be to like especially onset things like we talked about voice onset time, like that would be really interesting, which obviously sometimes is onsetting to a vowel also, but yeah, I honestly haven't thought a whole lot about how I would put that into a study, like specifically what I would want to look at. But for pretty much all of you who were not there when Lucas did his presentation, he was talking about like consonants that actually already have a pitch to them before the vowel happens, and that is extremely interesting to me. So looking at those kinds of phenomenons, yeah, are just, I don't know. I don't have a good model for like what I would want to look at. There's just a lot to explore for sure, and it's very interesting. And obviously, I didn't do that at all here. I just looked at vowels only. So
yeah, this concept of onset is actually one of the more powerful pedagogical, identifiable, and trainable aspects. And Crystal, you want to explain what you found for vowel onset, not consonant, but vowel onset in your study, Crystal?
Sure. I'm taking a couple of seconds to recall my presentation.
You know the difference.
I remember now.
Rise time. I want you to talk about rise time at the beginning of your vowels.
Quite honestly, a quick summary. My research on that is basically selecting a very short excerpt from the Mort d'Ophélie written by Hector Berlioz, and we chose two different interpretations. One is more sympathetic, one is more emphatic. Relative to voice onset time, we do see some of the consonants. We selected 4 consonants, which are the P, T, and another consonant that I don't remember, I'm sorry. There's not really that big of a difference when comparing between the French consonants. But with vowel onset, we do see more faster, more abrupt onsets in the vowels. So
for which emotion?
Oh yes, sorry. In the emphatic interpretation.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at your recordings, Brianna, you have the same thing.
well, there we go.
Yeah, we just didn't bring it up. I was negligent. What other questions do we have, Crystal?
I have one more question. So let's say I am.
By the way, we have just been able to complete the entire meeting because a cat went by.
Yes, a black cat crossed our path, and now it's officially October.
Right. So now we, we could not have stopped. I mean, we're not stopping, but we could not have stopped until. So go ahead, Crystal. Sorry.
No worries. I guess if a voice teacher who might not have the opportunity to be exposed to voice research experience, what is the major takeaway for them? How can they apply that to their teaching and working with different students?
Yeah, I guess are you asking about just these concepts in general without seeing anything like this at all?
I guess that is a good question. What would you, I guess, if you have a student who is struggling with registral transition, what would be something that you would listen for? Let's start with that.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good question.
In the context of your study, what would you kind of expect to hear that's messed up?
Yeah, so one thing to listen for would be adduction, right? Like what's if there's a more breathy sound in one area or a more adduct sound in the other area, and which one, like through the transition, what's that mean then? Um, so that's something to listen for sure. That I saw in my own project. Also the vibrato. I mean, like that was like very apparent for me, especially in the bottom. So just listening for changes in vibrato, whether it's wider, like the extent greater, or it's faster. Listening for those kinds of things. Just vowel intelligibility also, because obviously like the changes in format relationships with the harmonics is gonna affect that or be happening if you're hearing different things. So I guess those are things the main things I would listen for without being able to look at a spectrogram and go, oh nope, here's this value, it's this, you know. That's a really good question.
So I want to emphasize what this as Crystal and Carolyn and who else is here has been Mickey, kind of basically Mickey. The experience of this program and this particular research project is to have a taste of research science where a small project is pursued, and then as soon as the small project is defined, it becomes a huge project to everyone. And unfortunately or unfortunately, but it really, students, it really does give you a sense of what research is all about, how difficult / easy it is, how research in singing is a miracle because so few people um, are assigned the task on faculties, etc., to do research, because most of the faculty cannot do research in singing because they must do research in other areas where they might get grants and things like that. But from a global point of view, we do have more people interested in more singing science and singing research. But to my way of thinking, it has to come out of music. So there has to be a much deeper training in voice science, voice research, singing, and all aspects that are connected with that um, from within the singing community, within the music community. And so programs like this and others that are existing around the country and around the world, actually a little bit, and the growing ones, they have to be pursued. And we need more students. So I just think that in order for the science of the singing voice to really, really take off well, it's got to come within music. And so the collaborations are critical until there's independence inside the music world. But, you know, the probability for that's pretty low stuff still. So, but I can't tell you how much Jane and I really appreciate the work, the interest, the dedication to the students of the program have taken in both the courses and the research, the diligence and interest, and knowing how it's changed their own singing and their teaching has been wonderful. So thank you very much, Brianna. Um, it's a great thing.
Happy.
Now, everybody, if you do this with your hands, you can give a high five to your neighbor. So it's a virtual high five.
I'd like to ask Brianna a question. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, Brianna, that was so well done. Oh
Thank
my
you.
gosh. You're so brilliant. It's so impressive and so well done. I was just wondering, what did you learn about yourself from doing this this research? That was pretty extensive and really fascinating. What kinds of things did you learn about you from doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this goes far beyond learning things about just my singing. Far beyond. It was definitely very eye-opening and confirmed and contrasted things that I thought or perceived about my own singing. So that was really interesting. Things like it was really cool to see that, like, yeah, my top transition is pretty good. Like, it's pretty good. It's pretty evened out. That's awesome. But also like things in the bottom transition where I'm not as confident, or things like using a more closed vowel, which I was not used to doing until more recently when I started using eval for a lot of things. That was also like confirmed and contrasted some things I thought about, like my chest voice region, which was why I wanted to look at these things, of course, is to better understand them. But it's funny because before, I've kind of been using a different strategy since this project, especially in the bottom, of really trying to maintain the resonance from like the head and middle when I go down. And it's really interesting because I didn't think that I would be able to access as many notes in the bottom, but that's not turning out to be the case. So it's already changed the way I approach my bottom transition a lot. Just like hearing this over and over again and looking at the subharmonics and wanting it to be better coordinated. But yeah, so it definitely taught me a lot about my own singing, and again, confirmed but also contrasted things and perceptions I had about it. Also, just as far as like emotional intent, it was very reassuring to realize that like the emotion's not getting in the way of the singing, thankfully. And I think for the most part, and that was nice to see and perceive, but also to realize like there could be there's so many other ways to explore contrast with emotion that does not affect the larynx, like doesn't affect what's going on here, that I want to be able to do more of and better. And one of those things was just dynamic contrast. That was so interesting, and it kind of came out towards the end of analyzing this. It was the bereft excerpt having that contrast of 16 dB. That's like pretty significant. And realizing there are many other factors I can play with to have the effect of the emotional, difference without getting in the way of my larynx. So that was really interesting. Also just taught me a lot about my own perseverance and commitment to things that I really do care about and love and want to pursue. And again, just kind of like opened my eyes to this whole world and it being like approachable. Like I do know things about science and I can use it to explain things about this world that I've always come from. Coming from the arts, going into this is kind of daunting because there hasn't been a lot of crossover. It feels completely separate. And so yeah, I've learned a lot.
Have you ever done any kind of study like this before? I mean, not like this, but not this extensive, but anything close to this? No.
Not at all. I had looked at my singing on once on a spectrogram before I came here to BG one time in undergrad voice ped, and I happened to have a scope of my larynx because I did have a blood vessel burst and I had to get scoped. So that's the extent of my knowledge beyond undergrad ped before I came to this program, was seeing my own larynx and having once looked at a spectrogram of my singing.
Yeah, we start from scratch around here.
Wow.
Yep. It's amazing. I can't believe how much I've learned in a year. Like, blows my mind. Very cool.
This is why the speech science and the voice disorders combo for this program are pretty critical, aren't they, Brianna?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you again, Brianna. I'm aware that we've had a couple folks in the comments say great job and then had to go.
Yes.
But you did wonderfully.
Cool. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'm very pleased with this experience and the culmination of it. So I'm really glad to share it with all of you.